Amelia Taylor was the first African-American woman to hold the position of chief of staff for a respected political leader in the city. An ambitious woman with an impeccable track record, she had navigated the intricate world of politics with grace and intelligence. However, on this cold November evening, her world was about to change in ways she never anticipated. After a long day at work, Amelia decided to visit a local park. She often found solace in the quiet of nature, a stark contrast to the fast-paced life in the city. As she strolled through the park, lost in her thoughts, she didn't notice the dark sedan trailing behind her. Officer Marco Daniels, a seasoned but weary cop, was on his routine patrol when he noticed Amelia walking alone in an area that had recently experienced a series of unsolved break-ins. His eyes narrowed as he observed her. From his perspective, Amelia didn't belong there. A woman of her stature, dressed in high-end business attire, walking alone in a secluded part of the park at this hour? Suspicious. "Something's off," Officer Daniels muttered to himself, pulling his car over. Without thinking, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the vehicle, his hand instinctively hovering over his holstered gun. Amelia, unaware of his presence, continued her walk until she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see the officer approaching, a stern look on his face. "Excuse me, ma'am," Officer Daniels called out. His voice was firm, almost accusatory. Amelia's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively took a step back. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, trying to maintain a calm demeanor despite the sudden tension in the air. "What are you doing here?" The question was blunt, with no hint of politeness. Amelia raised an eyebrow, surprised by the officer's tone. "I'm just walking through the park," she replied, her voice steady. "Is there something wrong with that?" Officer Daniels scrutinized her for a moment as if weighing his options. His eyes darted to her handbag. "I need to see some identification," he demanded, his hand still hovering over his belt. Amelia paused for a moment, a wave of confusion washing over her. "Why? I haven't done anything wrong." Daniels didn't respond immediately, only stepped closer, his gaze never leaving her. "I asked you for your ID, ma'am." "Now," he insisted, more forceful. Amelia sighed, her hand slowly moving to her purse. She pulled out her wallet and handed him her ID. Daniels snatched it from her fingers almost aggressively and began inspecting it. As he glanced at her identification, his face remained expressionless. "Amelia Taylor," he read aloud, "Chief of Staff to the Governor." Interesting. Amelia felt a knot form in her stomach as she realized he had no idea who she was. "Yes, that's me," she answered, trying to keep the frustration from seeping into her voice. Daniels didn't seem to care. He stuffed the ID into his pocket without a word. "You can explain yourself at the station," he said curtly, grabbing her arm and leading her toward his patrol car. "Wait, what?" Amelia protested, trying to break free. "This is ridiculous. I haven't committed a crime. You can't just arrest me like this." "Ma'am, you'll have your chance to speak at the station," Daniels replied coldly, not looking at her. His grip tightened around her arm, and Amelia could do nothing but follow, seething with frustration. As Daniels drove her to the station, Amelia's mind raced. What could he possibly think I'm guilty of? She had walked in this park countless times without incident. The fact that this officer seemed so intent on taking her in filled her with a sense of dread. The drive felt endless, and when they finally arrived, Amelia was led inside with no explanation. The officers at the desk eyed her in confusion, and a few exchanged whispers, clearly curious about why a well-dressed woman was being escorted in by a cop. Amelia was pushed into a small, cold interrogation room. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving her alone to stew in her thoughts. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but there was something chilling about being treated as if she had. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, the door opened and Lieutenant Greg Simmons, a man known for his level-headed demeanor, entered the room. He was tall, in his late 40s, with salt-and-pepper hair and a kind but weary face. "Miss Taylor," he began, extending his hand. "I apologize for the inconvenience. I've just been briefed on your situation." Amelia shook his hand, her frustration evident. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'd appreciate an explanation for why I was brought here. This is utterly ridiculous." Simmons nodded, flipping through the paperwork Officer Daniels had hastily filed. As his eyes scanned the report, his expression faltered. "According to Officer Daniels, he found you walking suspiciously in the park. He thought you might have been up to something." Amelia's jaw tightened, her patience wearing thin. "I was walking through a public park, that's all. No one has the right to treat me like this based on assumptions." Lieutenant Simmons sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I understand. This doesn't make sense." Before he could say more, the door swung open again, and Officer Daniels walked in. He looked at Amelia for a moment, his eyes avoiding hers. "I found her wandering around late at night in the park," Daniels said, as if justifying his actions. "She was alone, and it looks suspicious." Simmons raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious?" His voice was sharp, his eyes cold as he turned to Daniels. "You do realize who this is, right?" Daniels blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "This is Amelia Taylor," Simmons said, his voice even. "She's the chief of staff to the governor. You don't recognize her?" Daniels' face turned pale. I didn't know." Simmons shook his head in disbelief. "This is not how we operate, officer. You have made an arrest based on nothing but assumptions. You've overstepped your authority." The words hit Daniels like a punch to the gut. He had never expected this situation to spiral out of control so quickly. The other officers who had gathered near the door watched in silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. Simmons continued, his voice cold and decisive. "You need to understand that assumptions like this are dangerous. This is harassment. Do you realize that?" Daniel stood frozen, his face flushed with embarrassment. He stammered, trying to find words, but none came. Amelia stood up, her posture straight and commanding. "I am willing to let this go, but I demand an explanation. I deserve at least that much." Daniels couldn't look her in the eye. He had no excuse. He had treated her with suspicion simply because of her appearance, and now everything was crumbling around him. Simmons turned to the other officers in the room. "Officer Daniels, you're suspended pending an investigation. You've made a grave mistake, and you will answer for it." Amelia turned to leave the room, but before she did, she glanced back at Officer Daniels. "You'll have to live with this mistake, officer. You've made an assumption, and now your career will reflect that." As Amelia left the station, she knew that the world wasn't always fair, but she also knew that sometimes justice came at a cost. And for Officer Daniels, the price of his assumptions was about to be higher than he could ever imagine. Thank you for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating tales. See you next time.